they each need something from the other in their kind of mutual political theater, thinking of legacy, of political survival.
During this time, hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians were killed. And some of them, many dozens of them, killed while they are queuing to get food.
This negotiation that we have seen go round and round for so many months now really requires determined diplomacy, and it requires investment from the president.
I think Trump will approach this thinking, I gave Netanyahu a lot during my first term. I recognised Israel's claim to Jerusalem. I recognised their claim to the Golan Heights. I am certain that he will want something in return for that.
Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. This week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made his third visit to the White House since President Donald Trump's return to office. There is talk of a temporary ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza, paving the way for a longer-term deal down the road, just possibly. Netanyahu said Israel and the US were working on finding countries to offer Palestinians a better future, amid concern that that might mean proposals by Israel to transfer Gaza residents abroad. During the meeting, Netanyahu also presented Trump with a letter saying he had nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. It's noteworthy that most of the two men's meetings so far have been in private, Trump perhaps mindful that in 2011 Netanyahu famously lectured then President Obama in public about what Israel would and would not accept. We're going to talk about that meeting. We're going to talk about the state of negotiations, and then we're going to talk about long-term plans, rival plans, for what might come out of the bitter conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Joining me today are four of my Chatham House colleagues, because we have a lot of depth on this. Steve Farrell, Sanam Vakil, Yossi Mekelberg, and Max Yoeli. Yossi, what did you make of it?
To a large extent, much ado about nothing. Everyone had kind of high expectation last week that it will end with announcement on a ceasefire, and all of we got that there is good progress. Meetings in Doha, some briefing of Israeli official that the negotiation achieved 80%, but we all know that in negotiation the last 20% are actually the most crucial to reach any agreement. So it's basically wait and see. And again, it's basically two men playing each other to the best of their ability. One is, nominates the other to Nobel Peace Prize. The other is playing surprised that it actually happened.
He said, that I did not know.
It was utter surprise. And then said that it's coming from Netanyahu. That means a lot, or something along this line. But when it comes to the actual issues of dealing with the end of war, the release of the hostages, humanitarian aid entering into Gaza and moving to Gaza beyond the war, we haven't heard anything.
Max, what did you think?
I would agree that the meeting was an anticlimax of sorts, with the only really tangible outcome being that Nobel Prize nomination. But I think it's an important waypoint in terms of taking stock of the relationship, and in particular, where Trump and Netanyahu have come since the low points in their often strained relationship, even as they hold each other superficially close. Thinking of Netanyahu's calling then President-elect Biden to congratulate him in 2020, something that really got under Trump's skin. And I think it says something broader about the U.S.-Israel relationship. The context for the relationship changed on October 7th. Biden really tried to hold close and bear hug Netanyahu, both physically upon visiting Israel, but also in terms of the policy and politics to try to restrain some of Israel's more expansive behavior and also to prevent criticism from the right within the U.S. And I think last night's meeting shows that Trump continues a different type of embrace with Netanyahu. They each need something from the other in their kind of mutual political theater, thinking of legacy, of political survival, and that kind of toxic symbiosis will continue to bind them together as they work to resolve the Gaza issue and broader regional issues.
So, Sanam, what do you make of that? From Yossi and Max, we've just had this picture of almost immobility, the two men bound together, the US not putting, therefore, significant more pressure on Israel also continuing to need the US's support. Is that how you see it?
Yes, very much so. I think this is an immovable problem for all involved right now. And while President Trump would like to see a deal in Gaza and would like to continue to live up to this image of deal maker, I don't think that he has the capability to achieve a deal so quickly in this context without pressuring Prime Minister Netanyahu over some key issues, and at the same time, of course, investing personally in this process. This isn't just a TV show or sort of optics. This negotiation that we have seen go round and round for so many months now really requires determined diplomacy, and it requires investment from the president. And it's hard to see things getting off the ground without a different change of tact, particularly on the US side.
And what would you say that the US is bombing of Iran in support of Israel's pursuit of Iran's nuclear program? What has that done to the relationship?
Well, I think for Prime Minister Netanyahu, that perhaps gave him confidence in a relationship that hasn't always been easy, as Max mentioned, but it's important that he doesn't read overconfidence. And I think there's always been a bit of unease between them, and this sort of sycophancy of nominating President Trump to receive a Nobel Peace Prize is reflective of that. I think President Trump went in on the Israeli campaign for American objectives and wanting to be seen as a bold leader willing to make bold moves against a longtime adversary in the Middle East. It was, of course, a big help to Israel, but right now, President Trump is also seeking a deal with Iran, and it will require President Trump there to restrain Netanyahu and bring him on board to support that process, which we have to see how that unfolds as well.
Yes, we do. Steve, so far this is sounding very comfortable for Netanyahu and Israel. Is this a relationship that at this point the Israeli Prime Minister can take for granted?
No. I think there are two vast imponderables here, and that is, what does Trump want? And if he finally decides what he wants, will Netanyahu do what Trump says? And I think it would be foolish to predict what Trump wants. We know what he has wanted. He said the Palestinians can leave. Now, it was all wrapped up last night in terms of Netanyahu talking about it's freedom of choice. They can go if they want to. They can stay if they want to. But there's very little doubt that certainly Netanyahu's vision would be, and he has embraced it. Netanyahu has said one of the war aims is now to embrace Trump's vision of moving Palestinians, some or all. I mean, the devil will be in the detail on that, but certainly Palestinians will be opposed to any leaving.
We'll come on to that later, but just on this point of, can Netanyahu really think that Trump is more or less on his side? Israel is not going to get significant pressure from the US to do a ceasefire, or we might come on to the West Bank to stop what it is doing in terms of taking land on the West Bank.
I think Trump will approach this thinking, I gave Netanyahu a lot during my first term. I recognised Israel's claim to Jerusalem. I recognised their claim to the Golan Heights. I am certain that he will want something in return for that. As one of my colleagues mentioned earlier on, he was miffed that Netanyahu recognised Biden. So Trump will want something. And Netanyahu, we know, is in a very delicate situation at home. Far right-wing coalition members openly saying they want the expulsion of the Palestinians, and he faces his own legal troubles at home. So as Yossi said at the beginning, both are conducting a very delicate dance, and it really comes down again to two imponderables. What is Trump going to come out saying he wants? Will he continue to embrace his plan, or will he move towards other options, realising perhaps the level of opposition in the Arab world to that? And will Netanyahu do what Trump says?
So let's go on to the detail of ceasefire negotiations. There are indirect talks in Doha this week between Israel and Hamas. US envoy Steve Witkoff is expected to join in person to try to get this process to move forward. Yossi, where are we? And this is painful. I mean, the death toll every day in Gaza does not stop. Many of those people trying to reach aid now being controlled, the distribution of it being controlled at the moment by an Israeli-led organization.
And that's what makes it so difficult. Bear in mind, because our attention was in Iran at least for 12 days, but during this time, hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians were killed. And some of them, many dozens of them, killed while they are queuing to get food. But the fact the IDF is involved with humanitarian aid when you have other organizations, including UNRWA and UNICEF and the World Food Organization, that actually experience in humanitarian aid.
And they were doing it in the past, and now this foundation has come in, and we've had reports of soldiers shooting Palestinians, saying they're trying to keep order, but as you said, the death toll is very high. So
they're not geared to deal with this kind of operation, not policing and not humanitarian aid. So this is one aspect of this. But The thing is whether you can do in a sequential way to end the war, release of hostages at the same time, and then look, for instance, they are talking about exiling the Hamas leaders out of Gaza. What's the role of the PA? What's the role of regional powers? All of this need to discuss almost at the same time. One of the issues, and I think Steve hinted to this, is that there are issues within the Israeli domestic arena. Netanyahu doesn't have a majority for any of these plans. And hence why he tried
Just
to
spell
play
that out.
Trump.
Not for any of these plans. Not for one focused on getting the hostages out.
Ironically, he has a majority in the Knesset, but not from within his own coalition. Because some others within the Knesset, whether it's Yesh Atid of Lapid or Benny Gantz, Machaneh HaMamlachti, they said, listen, if you reach an agreement, we'll support you in the Knesset, we'll give you the safety net. But this is not safety net, not to go for election, not for a vote of confidence later. So he needs to rely on the Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the ultra-right within the government, in order to pass it in the Knesset with support of coalition members. And for him, as long as he can stay until, who knows, later in the autumn, maybe into 2026, as Prime Minister, it helps him all to slow down the corruption trial.
Do you think he wants a deal at this point at all? Yes, there's pressure to release the hostages from parts of Israeli society, but there's also, as you've been saying, huge pressure to get rid of Hamas, his stated objective. Has he really got an incentive to stop right now?
I think Trump is his incentive. I think he understands.
But what we were discussing before, Trump's not really giving him any new pressure at all.
The thing is, for Trump, he has other priorities. The priority, for instance, to extend the Abraham Accords, and I think gradually filter through in the American administration that without some progress on the Palestinian issue, it would be very difficult to make progress on extending the Abraham Accord. I think Netanyahu understands that there's a need for a ceasefire. But if this is going to hamper attempts to derail his corruption trial, he probably will resist it.
Sanam, what do you make of this? You've been looking at this for a long time, as has everyone here, I have to say. But what do you make of whether Israel has an incentive at this point? And Yossi was mentioning the Abraham Accords, where some Arab countries normalised with Israel. Do you think the ever-dangling possibility of a deal with the Saudis is really an incentive on Netanyahu, or are there no incentives and he just wants to keep going?
I don't think right now Netanyahu is in a position to sign anything permanent and to deliver anything beyond temporary ceasefire. And that's because his domestic coalition, as Yossi mentioned, is very fragile. He is under pressure from within his coalition to expand settlements in the West Bank. And I think he's overconfident that Trump will continue to press the normalization button, and he assumes, I think mistakenly, that Arab leaders such as the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman will be there regardless of what happens. And what he's miscalculating on that front, and this is why the normalization discussion is so far-fetched right now, is that Netanyahu himself, and I think Israel more broadly, is very isolated across the Middle East. And that vision to normalize Israel into the region has really been set back by the war in Gaza, the lack of humanitarian aid and delivery, what many people see to be also a violation of international law by the Israeli government. And I think, let's just throw in one more, Arab states are very concerned by Israel's persistent military aggressiveness across the region in Syria, seeking to attack Lebanon at will. And the 2-week war against Iran was also sort of the icing on the cake of a very hyper-militarized country that will be hard to normalize with at the end.
And you could throw into that actually what Israel is doing in southern Syria, all kinds of things. So from you, there's not a picture of there really being significant pressure on Israel to change course at all. Max, where is American public opinion on this, do you think? We had, not so long ago, it seems, substantial campus protests still there. That died down a bit. Still a lot of controversy over that. On the other hand, you have an administration very much behind Israel, some members of it, even more vocally so than President Trump.
I would say that public perceptions of Israel have shifted significantly throughout the 21st century, but especially the last year or two. And the bulk of that shift is happening within the Democratic Party. I think about 1 in 3 Democrats has a favorable view of Israel today. And no country around the world has a larger partisan gap in terms of favorability and perceptions between the parties as Israel. I think as Netanyahu approaches the situation and thinks about outcomes, he also has to be mindful of the asymmetry that the Trump administration brings to the table. And what I mean by that is, if it looks like there may be a good outcome, as with the Iran strikes a few weeks back, I think President Trump will eagerly jump on board and front run it to claim credit, whether or not he has a kind of a primary role in shaping the outcome. But if there's a failure, I think he would be more than happy to wash his hands of it, to walk away, to harangue, to punish.
To say, I've had enough of these people.
And to abandon it. For a leader to seek only the upside of a risk without putting themselves on the line, making themselves truly vulnerable, to be on the other side of that bet, as Netanyahu might be, is a really challenging situation. And the one thing I'd add, just in terms of Trump's domestic equities, is his bombastic support for Israel, or for Netanyahu's vision of Israel, ties into his domestic interests in that he has used anti-Semitism as a cudgel in his effort to cow universities and to reshape American society to some extent. And so long as he can retain that kind of support of Israel lane very strongly, and so long as Democratic support continues to erode, I think that's a powerful domestic political cocktail that will create interesting dynamics for electoral politics going into 2028.
Thanks for that. So, Steve, let me pull this together as we just come to the end of this second question on the current state of ceasefire negotiations, because the picture, I think, around this table is that they're not moving at all, even if people are appearing in Doha and having talks, that there is not an incentive on Israel to change course at this point. Israel is doing what it wants to do, which is keeping control of Gaza at huge cost to the Palestinians, and settlers are moving forward on the West Bank with a lot of harassment of the Palestinians. Does this just go on, in your view? What could change that picture?
There is some progress. I mean, the ceasefire talks that are going on in Doha, there are gaps. All sides are saying there are gaps, but they believe they can be reached. I do wonder, if we do get a 2-month ceasefire, if there is a pause, how much would the Israeli domestic opinion, how much would exhausted Israeli military soldiers, reservists, how much would the world looking on react if, after another 2 months of ceasefire, Netanyahu goes back to full-scale military, as we saw him do a couple of months ago? So let's be clear, he has done it before. Yeah. Would world tolerance for that continue? I'm not sure.
I think that's right, and we haven't really touched on European pressure, but European countries, including the UK, beginning to take a distinctly different line from the US on this, but then they got distracted by the Israel's and US's strikes on Iran. So let's come to our third question, really about rival plans for Gaza, and I'm going to talk about a Palestinian state, if there is a ceasefire. Everything hangs on that. I was in Jordan a couple of weeks ago, and people began so many sentences with, if there is a ceasefire, then we can begin talking. Yossi, what are the kind of plans out there?
Yeah, I think when you have 21 months of trying to achieve ceasefire, and there was a ceasefire outlined 3 phases, and this failed, people start saying it's going to happen, another one. May I just add something to what Steve said? Israel also pays heavy price right now in Gaza, losing soldiers there every week. And this goes to how the Israeli public opinion sees the war.
And the disruption of this, which is showing up in the economic figures.
People are losing their job, their business are collapsing.
Because they're reservists in the IDF.
So absolutely. Just this week, I heard a mother that lost her son on the Israeli radio. He spent almost full consecutive 8 months in reserve. This is basically, you can join the army. You don't need to be a reservist for this anymore, with life-threatening risk. So this is serious for the Israeli society.
That's an important point, and it is taking its toll. But let's come on to, if there is a ceasefire, what are the kind of plans you were beginning to tell us before that Israel might entertain?
First, we need to see the state of Gaza after 21 months. That 70% of Gaza is destroyed. Talking about more than 57,000 people killed. Basically, there is no governing system there anymore. So you need almost to rebuild Gaza from scratch. Okay,
so everyone's agreed on that. But it's a question of who's in Gaza?
There is the Cairo plan that talks about, first of all, to invest $53 million $1 billion into this plan. And there is need an interim governance, probably in my mind, that will include the Palestinian Authority that Israel opposes at the moment, together with regional powers. And again, something that Steve mentioned earlier, the idea of the Riviera and the idea of pushing more and more Palestinians either out or, as we hear in the last few days, of concentrating most of the Palestinians in south of Gaza in sort, again, another euphemism of a sort of a humanitarian enclave. So when we look at all of this, we are not there yet, but we know that at the end of the day, we can't also see Gaza separate from the West Bank and separate from the Palestinian issue as a whole. But it needs to be staggered one by one.
You've got a lot of bits there, which I'm going to tease out, but I just wonder on this, you haven't used the phrase two-state solution, which feels like a relic sometimes of the 1990s. Is there any appetite in Israel at the moment? Memories of October 7th obviously still very fresh. Is there any appetite for talking about that kind of future state for the Palestinians?
After the last nearly 2 years, there is no appetite for that. But this, as such, doesn't worry me, because this change can change very quickly. Those of us who remember Oslo in 1993, if you ask a few weeks before the Oslo Accords were signed, whether anyone wants to sign an agreement that suggests two-state solution, let alone direct negotiation between the PLO, that was a criminal offense in Israel at the time, most people will say no. So I look at this public opinion. Obviously, it's very worrying, but I don't see any alternative to some form, in my mind, a confederation of a two-state solution, because what's the alternative to that? It's occupation, it's domination by one of the sides, it's chaos. So that's what's left as maybe not a panacea, but the best out of all other options.
Obviously, this Israeli government would contest, does contest that point. Sanam, do you think that the possibility of a Palestinian state is still live?
I think it is. It has to be. There is no choice for it, because
What? Can you complete that sentence
Yes.
then? What if there isn't one? What happens then?
What if there isn't one? I think that's something that Israelis have to really consider. I think what's problematic since October 7th is that Israelis blame the concept of a two-state solution for October 7th and their horrific attacks, rather than really reflecting on their own government's responsibility in quote unquote mowing the lawn with Hamas over a 20-year period, or playing factional politics between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas itself. I think that there needs to be some real reckoning and accountability within Israel. And it's time, actually, for Israelis themselves to wake up from the stupor and become aware that they are isolated, and that the dynamic right now is unsustainable for their own security. And then morally speaking, what's happening in Gaza is something that I think Israelis also have to reckon with. And there are politicians in Israel that are beginning to maybe intimate that the status quo is unsustainable. But we need some bold leadership, and there actually needs to be social engagement with the dynamic.
And you pulled out two consequences there for Israel. One is a perpetual conflict, if you like, with bitter, furious, disempowered people who haven't been given a state, and the other one is being, in the current phrase, an international pariah. Yossi, just picking up Sanam's points there, do you think there is an appreciation of those points in Israel?
I think it will take time. I fully agree with Sanam about this. That there is no alternative to some form of two-state solution. The fact that Israel is becoming a pariah state. We know even in the British media, some of leading figures that supported Israel changed their mind, and generally in government, Israel is becoming more isolated internationally. Now, what's the alternative? If Israel wants to stay or to rekindle the idea of Jewish and democratic, it has to end the occupation. And while you have elements with the government don't always want to end the occupation, they want the expansion not only in Gaza. In their idea is the annexation of the West Bank, which may push Israel more and more into becoming a pariah state. There must be an alternative, and that's the point about leadership. There must emerge after the war. It will take end of war, people returning to some normalcy, to think about, as the last 30, 40 years of building settlements and moving to the right serve the Israeli society, or actually exactly the opposite.
Max, how is this being covered in the US? And I'm thinking the US media, I mean, this has gone down the decades, but particularly the last 40 years or so of many, many American attempts to broker peace. I'm thinking of all the wire accords and the Camp Davids and this kind of thing. And I can detect sometimes a note of exhaustion, even in the description of this now. But now we come to this much more bitter point after all these years of trying. How is this conflict at the moment being covered?
I think the exhaustion and the bitterness is a reflection of what has, taken root domestically as a very toxic, difficult, ongoing battle daily in campuses and local and state government races. We just had the New York mayoral race, and Israel was a major issue in that election as well. So that something so far away could seep into the day-to-day of American life, the fabric of American society in such a...
And a candidate who was critical of Israel did surprisingly well.
Yes, and will be the Democratic nominee. So I think that speaks to the exhaustion. In looking at the administration, I think there's a sense that its preference is to reach a deal rather than specific care for the contents of that deal. And I think the nature of the administration's national security apparatus, one that is understaffed with senior principals having several jobs at a time, Marco Rubio being the archivist and the national security advisor in addition to the Secretary of State, and also increasingly willing to politicize intelligence. So injecting doubt whether the president is fully seeing the full picture. I think it speaks to a process that may lead to a much more personalized outcome whereby the president is willing to give a thumbs up or thumbs down, more driven by the headlines than the content of such a deal. And that is something that the parties may be able to turn to their advantage in terms of reaching an agreement, but it is not necessarily conducive to long-term strategic thinking about the region or about the U.S. role in it.
Steve, you wrote a book on Hamas and have had reason to update it. What do you think of all the talk about future Palestinian leadership? Is there a place for Hamas in it?
I think all of the plans that are talked about ultimately come down to two things. Who runs Gaza and who's going to pay for the fantastically large amounts of reconstruction that are going to be needed. The Arab plan, which the White House and Israel have pretty much outright rejected, suggested the Palestinian Authority in some form come back, technocratic Palestinians be involved. The Israelis have shut down any involvement of the PA. Hamas, I think, now seem willing to take a step back, take a step down. There is anger against them in Gaza.
That was what I was being told in Jordan a couple of weeks ago, actually.
Yeah, there's unquestionably anger against them in Gaza. I mean, I'm sure, obviously, fury at Israel, but clearly, I very much doubt that Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, who was one of the co-authors of October the 7th, the cross-border rampage in which so many Israelis were killed, I very much doubt that he still expected this many, many, many months on that Gaza would be devastated. And I think very few Palestinians would ever want to see anything like this again. So Hamas, I think, will take a step back, but they're not going to go away. They're not going to disappear. And even if Hamas as a name did, the strain of, if you like, Islamist Palestinian nationalism is going to remain alongside more secular Palestinian nationalism as long as the Israeli military occupation continues. And I think that's a reality that Israel is going to have to live with. And I think the region knows and is trying to make Israel understand. And obviously Netanyahu will be saying, has said, after October the 7th, my only concern is the safety and security of the people of Israel, making sure this never happens again, and making sure Hamas never can run Gaza again.
Sanam, I heard a lot in Jordan, as you will have done as well, about the fear of many Palestinians being pushed from the West Bank into Jordan, and you can hear very much the same kind of thing in Egypt. Indeed, one saying to me, in Jordan, well, that's when we come over the river, the Jordan River, wearing berets, meaning they'd fight. But could they actually resist if Israel does continue with its encouragement, if we can use that word, for Palestinians to leave?
Well, in the case of Jordan, I think they're under immense pressure, as you've mentioned. What's notable is that although bilateral ties are at an all-time low, Arab states like Jordan, have yet to formally cut diplomatic ties. So there are still diplomatic tools there. And if something more serious happens, I would fully expect the Jordanians, in unity with other Arab states, including the Egyptians and others, to make a bolder move. And they're very worried about the inflow of Palestinians. And this, of course, would put immense pressure internally on Jordan, that is suffering economically, also has a very vibrant and animated Palestinian population of its own. This would be a real red line, I think, for the region. But what we haven't seen, and I think this is equally notable, is enough outspokenness from Arab states on these red lines. These are sort of quiet whispers, but I think they need to be more bold and more forceful in making Israel understand that the status quo and the creeping annexation that we're watching is, again, not going to win at friends, not going to win at normalization, and that there will be consequences at the end of this.
So we're coming right to the end of this podcast, and I wanted to ask each of you, for all the jokes about peace prizes and so on, do you regard this as essentially the US's conflict to solve, or is it something that the region might be able to do in the absence of significant US pressure, which is the portrait we had at the beginning of this podcast?
Well, I quote John Kerry, said when he failed in his peace attempt, he said, "We can't want peace more than the sides want peace. And if they don't want peace enough, we will never manage to broker a peace." But sometimes I think the United States can tell the sides that they really want peace and
can give them a reason to want peace.
Exactly.
Even.
There are enough incentives there, they can do that. But the ability to have peace without the sides really commit that, I think it will be very difficult. It's a discourse within the societies.
I don't think you can impose peace from thousands of miles away.
I think Trump's outsized popularity in Israel and his willingness to buck convention, for better or worse, gives him an opportunity that may have eluded some who came before him. But whether he is willing to exercise that in a statesmanlike manner remains to be seen.
Sanam.
I think what's troubling to me is that all of the leaders across the region see the United States as the most influential player in bringing them to the table, if not thinking about peace. So whether we like it or not, until President Trump gets bored or moves on to the next issue, he is going to be influential. But I'm not convinced that he's going to have the attention span and be willing to pressure all sides, and especially Israel's leadership, to get to that peace deal and perhaps even to get to that Nobel Prize.
With that, we are going to have to stop. I'd like to thank Steve Farrell, Yossi Mekelberg, Sanam Vakil and Max Yoeli for joining me. Thank you very much for joining us. If you've enjoyed today, please do leave us a review. We always like to get them. Our producer this week was Amanda Nunn. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. We'll be here again next week.